All right, Hunter. I know we talked a little bit before, but still, kind of like introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah. My name is Hunter Eisenhower. Thanks for getting me on the podcast. I've done a lot of podcasts where I'm the interviewer, so it's cool to snap back into gears of being the person that's being interviewed. So we'll see how this goes. I'm used to asking the questions. My name is Hunter Eisenhower. I have been in high performance sport for about a decade now, and recently went through a big transition. A lot of people that are older than me, my mentors say you've either been fired or you're going to be fired. And the last, what is it, 4 months was my opportunity to be fired. Coaching change at ASU, new coach came in, they let me go, bringing in their own guy, and it was kind of like, okay, what am I going to do now? Luckily, I was mindful that that was a potential reality in the situation I was in, so I was diligent as I could be, while also being respectful of the job I had to do at ASU to build stuff on the side. And those things on the side became my main hustle as opposed to a side hustle. And then recently joined a company with a friend of mine
Nice.
um, that I'm really excited about that keeps me athlete facing. So there's really like three things: the four system, move the needle, and then the new company I'm a part of. And it's cool because they all are very different. One is athlete facing, where I still get to train athletes and work with athletes and have access to awesome resources. The Force System is more educationally based, and then Move the Needle is the podcast and the things that I do with Mike Sullivan, and we're able to learn from a lot of dope people. So my days, honestly, I've reflected over the last 3 months or so since it's been, and my days are, I mean, incredible. I couldn't ask for a better situation. I get to wake up with my daughters and go to the park with them for a couple hours, work on stuff that I'm really passionate for a couple hours, eat lunch with them, travel some. So yeah, it's been great. It's been a fun transition, and I'm enjoying it.
Nice, nice. Um, I love your podcast.
Thank you.
I listen to most of them, and it's probably one of the best out there.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We were talking a little bit beforehand, but me and Mike said like, hey, we're gonna be consistent. We've now released an episode 158 weeks in a row every Wednesday morning, and if nobody listens, we get to have really in-depth conversations with high-level people. And fortunately, some people listen, and we get to have those conversations. And it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. I think my network has grown more in the last 3 years from having the podcast than the rest of my career combined. So being able to connect with people pseudo face to face on a screen most of the time is awesome. And we have some in-person stuff coming soon. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Nice, nice. So I didn't send this question to you,
All good.
but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
Yeah.
I think 2 years ago, like my mentor Adam Petway got let go from Louisville,
Mm,
and it was honestly, it was the hardest thing in my life because I like imagine like cleaning your boss office is weird. And at the same time, he had to handle all that stuff. So talk to me about like how do you handle like because we're in this industry, you're gonna let go like you're gonna let go anyway. It's just a
yep.
matter of time. So
Yeah.
talk to me about how you handle that.
It's a really good question. I think I had a unique situation going to Arizona State that like when I got hired 3 years before I got fired, people were telling me like, hey, this is a little bit of a hot seat job. Like, hey, Coach Hurley's on the hot seat. And every year come January, February, March, you'd see those like hot seat lists be released by like ESPN, and Coach Hurley was always on them. And fortunate we were able to spend 3 years there together. And I think because of that, it allowed me to prepare myself like psychologically, and then with the things I was also doing to help my family be able to survive after the fact during. So every year come February, March, I was thinking like, shoot, is this the year? Is this the year? And it just happened to be this year. But I think the thing that was unfortunate, because I felt like it slightly tainted the season a little bit, but also fortunate because it allowed myself to prepare, is that the writing was almost on the wall this year. Like we would have had to probably make an Elite Eight, Final Four to stick around. I think the unfortunate situation was the retention process and my attempt to be retained, and that just like did not go how I envisioned at all. But when I got the call from the athletic director, like, hey, we're moving on, I was sitting there more so just like, it was very surreal. I wouldn't say that I was like devastated. I don't think I was sad. It was just kind of surreal. And I called the first person I called was my wife, and I've told this story a couple times now, but first person I called was my wife. I FaceTimed her, and we were obviously having conversations of like, okay, I think it's gonna happen. It's probably gonna happen. So it wasn't a shock to her really, but called her and told her, and it hit her harder than it hit me just because of the uncertainty it created. And she started crying, and she was in the car with my daughters, and she was like, "Okay, I'll see you at home." So I drive home, and my daughters are down for a nap when I get home, and we were just talking about it and just sitting there, and she said that after we hung up the phone, my f almost 4-year-old was like, "Mommy, why are you sad?" And she was like, "Oh, Daddy's done it at ASU, baby." And she was like, why are you sad about that? Like, he's gonna be home so much more. What a blessing. And like hearing that from her, like a 3-year-old, obviously she doesn't understand the financial implications and the things that go along with being fired. But I think just like hearing that perspective, it really changed the way I thought about the situation. And I went from feeling a little bit of frustration for how the process went and nervousness for the future and what it held to just like, if nothing else, I get to spend exponentially more time with my family, my girls, and that's the biggest win I could ask for. So I also like the pressure of providing and trying to figure it out. And I told my wife early on, and we made the decision like we want her to be able to be at home with the girls. So it was never a discussion of like, okay, well, babe, now you got to go get a job. It's like, no, I'll figure it out. I'm gonna make this work so we can keep our same life, and hopefully the only change is that I'm around more. So um, I think that it was surreal, but quickly shifted to like, wow, this is an incredible opportunity to spend more time with them and really pour into the things that I've become really passionate about.
Nice, nice. Uh, I'm sorry I have to ask this question, but the reason I ask it is because like there's a lot of young practitioner out there who just graduated or who's probably still in school who want to be in your like situation like ASU or who want to
Hmm.
be in mine with the agility team. But like the thing is like we're always constantly worried about getting fired, like
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a reality.
Yeah, and like you need to handle it with your family. It's just not yourself.
Yeah, I mean it changes things completely whenever you have a family, and especially once you start having kids, and in the situation that we were in where like my wife was at home and it's not like we have two incomes, and these are just like the realities that I don't think are often like talked about. And I understand that like if you're a young GA or a young coach, you might be single and just kind of like doing things yourself. Um, and I think it potentially makes it a little bit easier because there's less at stake when you get fired. But I still think that like it's productive, especially in the world we live in now, to create things for yourself that even create the smallest amount of stability outside of your day job. And I think that some people potentially still bristle at that because it's like, well, you're taking away from your day job to do those things. And realistically, like, I know, anybody that works at this level knows, like, you got a decent amount of free time. You might be on trips and you might be like, quote unquote, working, but like, how much are you actually training guys? How much you actually, whatever, treatment, nutrition? And there is time. And I think that if instead of you pouring into a Netflix show on trips and you pour into sustainability for your career, like it's a really good decision. So I don't even remember what the question was,
No,
but
no,
I
it's all
think
right.
that
It's all right.
I think that that is something that can be really productive. And the one caveat I'll make is when you're like a young coach, the thing that I truthfully kind of bristle at is like the coach who's just started their career, they're 21 years old and they like release a course. It's like use those years where you're younger, and it's not like I'm old by any means, but like use some years to gain experience, to gain knowledge where you're a sponge before you start pushing out water to other people. So I would say that that would be a big piece of advice for young coaches is like be mindful of what you could create, but don't be in a rush to do it.
Nice, nice, nice. I love it. This is very inspiring. I love it. Thank you.
Good,
Thank
I'm
you for
glad.
sharing all that because
Yeah.
I know like you had to go through a lot of stuff with like on your own. You have to go through a lot of stuff with your family. So thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah, definitely. Of course. I'm a pretty transparent person, so I don't you can ask away anything you got.
All right. So next thing I'm gonna ask, obviously, is force plate. Especially you just said like force plate coffee is your two favorite thing.
Yeah.
So, talk to me. I know like you have your own way of bucketing athletes.
Mhm.
So talk to me about your thought process on that.
Yeah, so my thought process for bucketing athletes, I think that force plates are an element of it, but they're not all of it. And I think that they get included when you go throughout the cascade of decisions that you make to bucket athletes, but I don't think initially that they are the first part. And I think that the way I've began thinking about bucketing athletes, or the way I bucket athletes starts with the distinction, and there's a lot of conversation around this and a lot of disagreements around this, but I think that the way I start with bucketing athletes is first two broad distinctions of are they more elastically driven or are they more muscularly driven? And you could also say, are they more connective tissue driven, contractile tissue driven? I don't like the names elastic and force driven because that is alluding to the fact that elastic athletes don't produce a lot of force. I don't think that muscular is synonymous with force. Anyways, just a small tangent. So that's really like my first big distinction that I make with an athlete. Now, the important thing with that is, okay, well, how do you make that decision? And I think you can begin to make that decision from the minute they walk into your weight room, the first time you ever see them, because I think that a lot of that elastic versus muscular driven is dictated by the structure the athlete possesses. So one of the things that you can do that I don't actually measure for because I think you can get an idea of the extremes, but that's infrasternal angle or ISA. And to me, ISA is a spectrum. Okay, so it's not either wide or narrow. It's a spectrum from wide to narrow. So that means there's athletes along that entire line. But the example I give is anybody that's in the basketball world can relate to this. And even if you're not in the basketball world and you know who these people are, you can relate. You know when Ja Morant walks into your weight room that they are different than Al Horford. If Al Horford walks into your weight room and Ja Morant walks into your weight room, we can begin to assume that their structure is a little bit different. And that is a distinction that we can make without a force plate, without measuring ISA. Now, where it gets a little bit hairy and where you need to dig into some more objective data is when you get like Jason Tatum walking into your weight room. Okay, so like I think in all of our heads right now, we can picture those three people and see that they probably live equidistance on that spectrum from Ja Morant being narrow, elastically driven, Jason Tatum being that like middle hybrid, and Al Horford being like that wide, muscular driven athlete. So that to me is where my bucketing system begins. And then I think the next layer does incorporate force plates. And this is where you can begin to dive into some of the stuff I've put out about archetype quadrants. And the archetype quadrants is a really simple construction to help us understand that elastic to muscular driven continuum a little bit better. So all it is it's a quadrant chart. You could literally set up in the Hawkins database. I use AI because you can infuse different variables than just two. But it's jump height on the y-axis from low to high and counter movement depth on the x-axis from shallow to deep. Now, what that does is it creates four quadrants. You have your top right quadrant that I call anchors, which is going to be deeper counter movement depth and high jump height. Then you have your whips, top left, which is going to be shallow counter movement, high jump height. You have your bottom left, which is going to be your rubber bands, which is your low counter movement depth, low jump height. And then you have your anchors, which is bottom right, which is deep counter movement depth, low jump height. So now we see, okay, what is this athlete's strategy? And counter movement depth, I think, is a forgotten about metric that's really important and can tell a lot about the actual archetype of the athlete. And then you have jump height, and that's just the effectiveness of the chosen strategy. The variable I like to add on top of that using AI is time to takeoff, and I represent time to takeoff with the size of the dot that the athlete represents. So a bigger dot would be a faster time to take off, a smaller dot would be a slower time to take off. So now we're able to see, let's say if we're just talking about a 15-man basketball team, okay, where does the athlete fall on this quadrant? And what's cool is I think that counter movement depth is probably the most accurate one metric you could choose to represent this elastic to muscular spectrum. Because now there's been people that have told me they disagree with this, and that's totally fine. But I see counter movement depth as a glimpse into what an athlete subconsciously selects from a tissue standpoint to predominantly contribute to movement. So what I mean by that is if an athlete chooses a shallow counter movement depth, to me, that is them relying on higher contributions of connective structures than it is contractile. A muscle in that sense with a shallow counter movement depth probably doesn't have a big opportunity to go through this eccentric lengthening and concentric shortening and pushing. In my head, a short counter movement depth shows an athlete that selects to lock the muscle like a isometric, quasi-isometric contraction and use the tendon to stretch and recoil off of that. Whereas a bigger counter movement depth is that bigger stretch of the musculature and more time to push. So that's the archetype quadrants, and then you get an idea of where they fall within that chart. Now, the power of this is where you see things that don't line up from the quadrants to the structure. So, for example, if you have Ja Morant walk into your weight room and they are cannon, so they're jumping fairly high, but they choose this incredibly deep counter movement depth. And let's say they're right at like the team average of jump height. Well, it might behoove that person to rely on slightly shorter counter movement depth. They might not jump higher, but it might contribute more to time to take off. Whereas you might see this wide Al Horford individual who self-selects a super shallow counter movement depth and doesn't jump very high. Well, maybe it would behoove that individual to be more effective if you actually shifted their counter movement depth to a little bit deeper to leverage the tissue, the architecture that they are predisposed to leverage better. So that's the archetype quadrants in a nutshell. And I think that also helps you to figure out n equals one situations where like maybe that wide that's self-selecting a short counter movement depth has previous, I don't know, has dealt with patellar tendinopathy their whole life. And it's like, why are they self-selecting that counter movement depth? Because they don't want to move that joint through a full loaded range of motion. And that's just something that we can discover by looking at these two simple metrics. So that's one layer of archetype quadrants. There's another layer. I feel like I've talked for a while, so I don't know if you want to like put a pin in it and then I can go to the next layer, or if you want me to just like keep rolling.
No, I like it. I like it. Keep going. I like
So
it.
the next layer that I did, and this was the last off season at ASU that I tried to layer into this concept was actually looking at the force time curve of a CMJ and determining training interventions based on that curve. So to try to make this not as long of a confusing monologue, I'll try to be a little bit more succinct with this application, but ultimately it's looking at the it's looking at the force time curve of CMJ in multiple parts. And I think that if anybody's familiar with the CMJ force time curve, you can probably assume the parts I'm talking about, but really it's like unweighting, braking, propulsion, and landing. And the ones that I really focus on that I think athletes can have a lot of success with is or need a lot of help with is the unweighting and braking portion. So whenever I'm looking at force time curves from initial jumps from athletes and I see an athlete that doesn't unweight very well, and that if you're thinking about the force time curve is that initial dip toward the bottom of the graph. And what I mean by not unweighting very well would be they can't reduce their body weight more than 90%. Well, to me, that's like, okay, we need to provide a stimulus, a cue, an intervention that allows this athlete to unweight more effectively. And we can talk about actual training intervention, but I also think it can just be the way you cue the athlete. The next portion would be braking. If we're looking at a forced time curve and we see like this gradual increase of the line as opposed to the steep vertical increase of the line, just by looking at the curve, I'm beginning to assume like, okay, this athlete is a gradual breaker. If you think about driving a car and you're driving really fast, and some cars have that handle that's an e-brake. If you see a gradual line, it's like an athlete like taking their foot off the gas and slowly putting on the brake, and it takes them a long time to come to a stop. Versus the athlete that's driving really fast and pulls the e-brake and is able to slam on the brakes in a way shorter amount of time. So the slope of that braking portion is something that I key on as well. And then propulsion is a little tricky because you can't depict as much from the actual curve. So that might be something that you dive into the metrics a little bit more. And then finally, landing. I think that the most glaring thing for me with landings is the asymmetrical nature of landings. And if there's an asymmetrical landing, that pattern continues to persist jump after jump after jump. And it's not just a one-off weird unbalance land. So understanding the curve allows you to, and it's not an overhaul to your entire program, but understanding the curve gives you at least the specific cues to, or constraints to put on different movements to elicit changes within the specific parts of the curve. And the last thing I'll say is I think that it's important to work sequential in the curve in terms of you need to create an individual that can unweight well, in my opinion, before you focus on their braking ability. And you need to focus on developing braking ability before you focus on propulsion. And then once you've got that figured out, okay, we can, or once you've got unweighting and braking, then we can hit them with more concentrically oriented movements. But I think that we need to, especially for uh, sport and also for the actual task itself, unweighting and braking needs to be shored up before we move on to just purely focusing on propulsion output, concentrically oriented movements. So that was a lot. Hopefully it made sense to you as I was going, but that's my thought from big, broad, they first walk into the weight room to really getting like under the hood and figuring out what these athletes need.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. So my follow-up question would be like, did you start, did you have a idea before you like map out all this, or you saw the data first, then you kind of like bucket it?
Yeah, that's a good question. How does my mind even get to these? Unfortunately, it's like hard for me to turn my brain off whenever I'm thinking about a topic that's like intriguing that I want to develop and think more about. So I think to me, it's questions that I ask and trying to find better, more objective ways to answer those. For example, like I've talked about the elastic to muscular driven spectrum quite a bit for a long time. And when people ask me like, okay, so like, how do you know? My only answer would be like, well, you know Ja Morant, you know Al Horford, and when they walk in your way, and it's like, well, like, okay, dude, but there's a lot of people that don't fall into those extremes. Like, there's just a lot more variables than just like that small snapshot. So then I was thinking like, okay, what could be used to understand this spectrum if this is what my programming decisions for the most part are hinged upon? And then that's when I began thinking about, for example, the archetype quadrants of like, is countermovement depth the perfect solution to deciding this spectrum? No, probably not. Like there's a lot more nuance to countermovement depth than just telling you an athlete's preference of leveraging specific tissue, but I do think it helps us provide a little bit more objective framework to the more subjective evaluation of Ja Morant and Al Horford. So I would say that, yeah, it comes down to me asking questions and trying to paint better pictures with my systems and how I think about things. And also just like noticing trends in data and trying to paint better pictures with the stories I try to tell, like with my programming.
I actually think it makes sense.
Yeah,
Like,
I've got some pushback for sure. There are definitely people out there that say like
is that peer
you're
reviewed or
making
whatever?
it, yeah, it's just like you're making big leaps, and it's like I put the disclaimer on everything that I'm not saying this is a perfect science, but I feel strongly enough that the actual structure and superpowers and kryptonites of athletes should be respected, that we need to continue to dive down this archetyping um, rabbit hole to better understand how to develop athletes. Because you hear the thing I say is like you hear it often, like the kid who was like super fast track athlete in high school, and then they went to college and they were like they never ran that fast again. And sometimes you hear because they went to a track program that just wanted to turn all their athletes into powerlifters, and they said Ben Johnson squatted whatever 405, so like everybody should be strong. And then you strip all these elastically driven individuals thinking that everybody should be able to squat heavy weight, and it's like that's just a small story to depict like we need to be mindful of the athlete in front of us, and structure and superpowers and kryptonites is, in my opinion, one of, if not the most imperative aspects to understand,
Hmm.
along with injury history, another big one.
Yeah. So I guess how deep did you dive into this ISA thing? Because I mean, it's not like peer-reviewed paper, but like honestly, I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
And if you think of it like ice angle, and when season go on, like more games, they're gonna be more stiffer, more shallow depth, more bouncy. Makes sense, right? So how deep did you dive into this ISA model? Because like there's a lot out there.
Yeah, there's a ton. Okay, so that's a good question. I would say that I got to the depth of which I needed to get to understand I don't need to go any deeper. And what I mean by that is like the first person I ever heard talk about ISA was Joel Smith on his podcast. And he's talked about it before, and he presents it in a way that is very digestible, hopefully in the way I talk about it too, where it's like, okay, there's physiological understanding in these definitions, but it's not so out there that it's like, dude, you're talking way over my head. So I got to Joel Smith first, and I was like, okay, this is really interesting. Like, who are the people around the country? Who are the coaches that are like talking about this and utilizing it within their programs? And the next person I came to was Rick Franzblau at Clemson, who I actually would love to have on the podcast at some point. And he took it a layer deeper, and he started talking about like internal pressures and nutated and counter-nutated pelvises. And I was like, whoa, this is getting to the point where I'm like, you're starting to talk over my head. So it was a good place for me to live for a while. And he actually was on Just Fly. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago, and had an incredible conversation with Joel about it to where it was slightly past my level of knowledge at that time, but not too far to where I was like completely out of bounds, where I was able to digest some of it. And that really hooked me on the importance of this. And then finally, the next layer I went was Bill Hartman. And Bill Hartman talks at a depth that's still over my head. And I'm like, geez, I can't even
Yeah,
get
no one understand what he
this.
says.
Yeah. And it's like, I think that it's important to at least be exposed to those concepts to understand that there's a lot more to it than the depth that I just spoke about it. But I also think that you don't necessarily need quite that depth to be able to make small tweaks to your program based on this information. So, yeah, I've journeyed down that rabbit hole over the course of a couple years and listened to a lot of people a lot smarter than me talk about it, and figured out ways to implement in my program that were effective and efficient and that made sense to me to better respect the structure of the athlete.
Nice, nice. Um, so I mean, if that's the case, because I kind of go that route too,
Mhm.
and somehow like I'm not a big force play guy, but like so if that's the case, like why do you like force play so much?
Man, that's a good question. Honestly, I've never even thought about why I like it so much.
Because if you think of it, if you like if we speak on that model, like there's a heel strike, mid stance, toe off, and people because just to make it digestible, because of proprioceptor, like they don't live in that, but like they're biased in one phase.
Mm.
So they're gonna be like jump forward, jump backward, whatever. And you see that all the time with athletes. So yeah, why do you like force plate?
Uh, okay, I'll tell a story, and this doesn't answer your question per se, but because I don't know. I don't know what it is about it. I can answer why I like a lot of things, but force plates, I'm not sure. That's a really good question. But I will tell a story of when I first got hired by the Sacramento Kings. I worked for an individual who now works for 1080 actually. His name's Jesse Green. And Jesse was one of the first people that looked at force plates in a way that was so much different than the way that I've heard in the past. I think that I think it's more prevalent now, but at least back then it was more prevalent to just talk about like jump height and braking RFD and peak relative propulsive power and these different metrics. And Jesse was the first one that was like, drawing up force time curves on a whiteboard and like telling me about different phases. He was the first person to ever talk to me about like bimodal primary, bimodal secondary, unimodal curve types, peaks. And he went as far as taking the force time curves of each athlete. I still have the presentation on my computer because he sent it to me. Taking the force time curves of each athlete on the roster at that time, making uh, um, inferences, decisions, explaining what he was seeing in the curve and sharing that information. And I believe, I don't want to say this wrong. So Jesse, if you're listening to this right now, I'm sorry if I'm misspeaking, but I believe to the point where he was like presenting this to like coaches in front office of like, these are the training interventions and this is why. So that hit me of like, man, if this is important enough that this director of performance in the NBA is taking this information to like a front office or a coaching staff, it must be pretty valid because you only got so many bullets as a in the NBA to take stuff to front office and head coaches, you know, and if he's choosing forced time curves as the thing that he's going to hang his hat on and think is important enough to like bring to those decision makers, then it must be pretty important. And I was just like so fascinated by the force time curve aspect of the way he like talked about it and presented it that then it gave me that I had plates myself. Like I had hours to experiment. And those experiments is what ultimately led to the force system and how I think about training and my methodology. So again, I don't know why. Maybe it's the lack of invasive testing procedure to gather such impactful, profound information on an athlete. Maybe it's just like the different ways that the information you can collect can be presented in the ways of like painting a picture with forced time curves to just getting more objective with metrics. I don't know. I don't know the exact reason. I just remember being fascinated from my first exposure. And I mean, until now.
Nice, nice. Um, I'm gonna put you in a spot.
No, it's all good. Feel free.
So, so obviously in the past few years, there's definitely coaches strictly follow the force time curve to train their athletes. And some of the coaches, what end up happening is like their athlete actually have like higher injury like rate than other athlete. So thoughts on that?
The coaches that specifically
Just
look
follow.
at forced time curves.
Yeah.
Um, I would probably say, well, the disclaimer I'll put is for as much as I love forced time curves, and I've asked the question to people before, like if you could only look at forced time curves or you could only look at metrics, what would you choose? And I am in the camp of forced time curves, but that's not to say that I don't look at or think that there's utility to looking at metrics. Like I said earlier when we were talking about training the curve, like unweighting and braking, I think you can get a huge, meaningful, impactful picture from looking at the force time curve. But when you get to like propulsion, for example, the peak of the curves tells you a little bit about how they're managing the things that are created before. But I think that if we're trying to isolate propulsion specifically, I think that it's important to understand the metrics associated with propulsion. So I think that while I think that there is a ton of validity to looking at force time curves, and I would choose to do that over metrics if I had to choose, there is still um, more given to your situation. There's more plugged into the equation by tying metrics into it. So I can't necessarily speak to your specific question of what you said or asked, but I would say that potentially it's because you are operating in too much of a black and white environment to where I'm the biggest proponent of forced time curves probably there is, but I still find utility in looking at metrics. And I think that that's probably the course that I try to take within my entire methodology is like, do I think probably more so than most that we need to respect the elastic qualities of elastically driven athletes and not load them with bilateral compressive full range of motion movements too much? Yes. Do I also think that there is a time and place for that intervention? Yes. So I think that anybody operating in two black of white siloed perspectives is probably going to run into issues versus somebody that can have their opinions and think a certain way, but still understand and respect the other side of that equation. And I mean, I think that that is like powerful for not just like training, but life. Like I think that anybody that walks through life, whether it's with politics or whatever it may be that are just like unable to see anything about another person's point of view or the other side of the spectrum, it's like it's probably going to get you into more trouble than uh is worth.
Nice, nice. Love it. Uh, so I mean, you use a lot of technology, force plate, 1080. I know you're
Mhm.
a fan of 1080.
Of course.
Um, thoughts on, man, this is gonna be tough, but thoughts on, I don't want to do this to you.
No, go ahead. Ask it. If I can't answer it,
Thought,
I'll just say I don't know.
thoughts on a force frame or overall groin squeeze for
Mm.
adductor or groin injury or a Nordic hamstring curl for whatever hamstring injury.
It's a good question. To be honest with
Stupid
you,
question.
I've never used the groin, whatever Vald calls it. I've never used that before in my entire career. I've seen it. I know what you're talking about, but I've never used it specifically. And my only exposure to evaluating hamstring strength using Nordics was all the way back to one of my first internships at the University of Washington, where that was part of their initial intake process. So I don't know. The one thing I will say is that I think that injuries in particular are so multifactorial that it's hard to pinpoint a hamstring injury to the lack of eccentric strength somebody displays in a Nordic. I think that my opinion on that specific intervention is there's potentially more effective ways to evaluate hamstring quote unquote strength. But uh, yeah, I just think it's injuries are so complex that pointing towards the inability to execute an assessment or the ability to as the reason for injury or not having injury is probably a little misguided.
Yeah. Sorry I had to answer this stupid question.
No, no,
But
no.
I just feel like a guy that loves technology asking this question would be like kind of interesting. So, but I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, no, no. I do. I think it's uh, an appropriate question because I think that you can begin to draw lines between different pieces of text and intervention and decisions that you make from that. And I think that, again, as much as I love force plates, there's still limitations to force plates. And do I predicate every decision I make off from a training process based on force plate information? No. But I think that there's a lot of value to collecting good information and good data from them to then help you guide decisions that you make within your training process.
Nice, nice. All right, last part of this podcast.
Yeah.
This is the main reason I want to have you here. Like, obviously, I'm a huge fan of like Jerry Romagito, and
Yeah.
I know you guys had him on your podcast, which is a really good podcast.
Thank you.
Um, so talk to me about like what you learned from him. That like I, I might not be using the exact word you say, but like kind of change like your approach to like training.
Yeah. Okay, so the thing you're referencing is, and I did this on purpose just to like stir a little bit of curiosity just for fun, but I put on a Instagram story like I had two of the most impactful days of my career recently. And there's a little bit of like a precursor story that I should probably tell before I talk about those actual 2 days. And that was that when working in the team setting, and you know this from being in the team setting, and anybody that works in the team setting probably knows, is that like it's very siloed. It's very scope of practice oriented. And if you're a performance coach, you don't have hands-on opportunities. And I understand different organizations probably operate differently. Different schools probably operate differently. But the organizations and schools and teams I've been a part of is like, if you're the strength coach, you work in the weight room and there's no hands-on anything. If you're hands-on, you can be in the weight room for rehab purposes, return to play purposes, but you're not like coaching athletes from a strength. So like everything's very siloed. And when I left the team setting, I was thinking like, man, you look at a lot of people on this side of things, on the, let's say, quote unquote, private side, and you see a lot of people doing both. And I've often thought like, okay, what can I do? How can I add this more like manual performance therapy aspect to my toolbox? And I'd ask chat all the time. I'd ask friends all the time, like, what do you think the best avenue would be? And like ChatGPT, for example, is like, go to LMT school. And I'm like, I don't have the time to invest in LMT school. Or like, go to PT school. It's like, I am not going back to PT school. Like, that's not relevant for my life at this point. So I was thinking, like, how could I do this? Like, where could I go? And people are talking about ART and different practices. And so I was like, okay. So I was in San Diego for the Alta Speed Summit and Mike G's event. And I only went to day one of the Alta Speed Summit. And during day one was Dan Path talking. He talked for about 2 hours, then we went outside. And Jerry was involved in this next portion where they were showing this performance therapy collaboration that they use at Altus. And it was Dan coaching and watching movement, him talking with Jerry, Jerry watching movement and being like, okay, Jerry, take this person over the table because I'm noticing X, Y, and Z, have some hands-on manual therapy input and let's try to create some sort of stimulus that way and then put them back out onto the field, let them move again and let's see if it changed. Let's see if it's improved. Let's see if the athlete feels better. And I was thinking like how powerful that would be if I myself, now that I have, now it's not like I'm going to be cracking necks and popping backs, but like even just basic, elementary, rudimentary understanding of like big toe extension and forefoot mobility. Like just that to me, like being able to do that before an athlete session is a huge impact. So I was thinking like, man, what do I do? Like I'm not going to go to LMT school. Should I just take this like ART certification, but then it needs to be hands-on? Am I going to fly across the country to go to this? Like a lot of just like indecision and confusion of what I should do. Finish that. We get Jerry on the podcast. We have a really long conversation. I had the opportunity to go out to Orange County after the podcast and spend 2 days with Jerry in this very low number in terms of attendance. There was me and two other people and Jerry. And for 2 days straight, we just went through assessment process, joint pumping, ART specifically, and then uh, um, a process to really like help ingrain the athlete with these changes that you made. So we went through from big toe to low back of big rock manual therapy interventions that you can do from an assessment and also like a treatment perspective to allow athletes to feel better, move better, all those things that I talked about before. And I left that experience thinking how incredibly impactful it was because I got exactly what I've been looking for. I'm not looking for 3 years of knowledge from PT school to be able to like assess, treat, pop, crack, whatever, release, all this. I just need the at least screwdriver in my toolbox. I don't need every tool to be able to have my hands on with an athlete and begin to assess big toe function, assess midfoot, calcaneal, tibial, internal, external, those different things. Now, people are probably listening to this right now and thinking like, dude, you had 2 days with somebody, you're not this manual therapist. And I understand that. Like, I'm not saying that now I'm going to go in tomorrow with an athlete and do a full lower body hands-on manual assessment and treatment. By no means am I saying that, but I now have the foundation. I now have the basic sequence. I now have the understanding from like a biomechanical, physiological perspective better than I did to practice these things, to understand these things better. I'm going to go to a event that Jerry's going to have with Dan here in Phoenix in September, I think, to get like another exposure to it. I'm like practicing all these techniques on my wife right now to like get more hands-on experience with this stuff. So it was so impactful because for so long I was thinking this could be an incredible value add to my skill set and to my athletes. I have no idea to add, and I don't even know what I'm looking to add. And then had him on the podcast talk for 90 minutes. The next weekend, I fly out to Orange County and get to spend 2 days with him. And I left like checking the box of what I wanted to know. Now, this is the beginning of a process to better understand it, to better learn how to utilize it and actually perform it. And I'm probably a pretty long ways away from actually like doing these things on an athlete. But at least I have like the foundation to then build from to be able to add that to my skill set when I'm working with athletes in this space. So it was, I don't know, maybe somebody's listening to that and they're like, dude, like, cool, 2 days of manual therapy work. Like, that's not that impactful. But for me, it was exactly what I was looking for in the exact time that I was looking for it at. So, it was just a really powerful addition to what I feel like I can already offer. And it was different, you know? It wasn't just like learned a new loading strategy that can change my program a little bit. It's like a completely other world that I can eventually offer to athletes.
I like it. I like it. Um, I'm gonna share something that's relevant, which my audience probably won't like it, but whatever. Who gives a fuck? Um, so obviously like NBA, hockey, NFL, all the pro like organizations start look dive into the biomechanics lab, 3D motion capture, triaxial force plate. Um, just from my experience, came like work for track, like
Mm,
having a manual skill,
yeah.
understanding like is the is the calcaneus able to evert or invert? Is it mid like do they have range of motion at the midfoot or big toe extension, tibia femoral rotation, hip internal external rotation? Having that knowledge and having that feel of like, do they have more internal rotation today than yesterday, or do they have less? Actually, like, help me a lot, and not just me, also my team. And a person you also know is Adam Petway, like my
Yeah.
mentor. We both kind of had that skill set, and we both think that actually helped us a lot, not just in terms of like, oh, keeping our athlete healthy, but we have a deeper layer of understanding like what exactly is like biomechanics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that like it also gives you another lens to look at movement through. Like I was just like when you listen to like Dan Path talk, when you listen to Jerry talk, it's like they have the most incredible eye to notice aspects of movement that they can begin to make inferences of like maybe it's this, lay on the table, let me check. Oh yeah, this is limited, let me do this. And I now being around them for a little bit and being exposed to that train of thought, it's funny, like it's beginning to add another layer to how I look at movement. Like I was just scrolling on Instagram the other day and somebody I follow posted a video of them themselves training. And the first couple of clips were them just hitting resisted sprints. And like a month ago, I don't think I've ever would have like saw this, but one of the things that Jerry talks about is like this ground up approach of like you need to have a step-by-step process about how you watch movement, or you're just going to be looking all over the place. Like, oh, right arm, left foot, right hip, rotate. So he goes ground up and he looks at the foot first. So subconsciously, I was just watching this person run, and the first thing I noticed was how externally rotated his right foot where it was versus his left. And I just commented like, "Yo, like, did you notice how like externally rotated your right foot was?" He's like, "Oh yeah, I noticed that. I wonder why it is." And I was thinking like, well, and this could be way off, but at least it's me trying to think in this way. Like, okay, like if we're talking about the foot and he rotates externally, maybe it's because he's trying to find a different way to achieve like dorsiflexion and like get over that foot. And is that a big toe? Is that mid foot restriction? Is that talus curl like restriction? Is that navicular restriction? And if I was dealing with him and I was in the room with him and I saw that and I felt more confident with my manual therapy skills, which some of these I don't even think you really need to be that skilled. Like midfoot oscillations. I could teach my 4-year-old to do, and she'd do a decent job at it. But I think that then it's like, hey, why is this happening? Okay, come sit on the table. Let me work on your foot for a second, assess big toe extension, assess how well your midfoot moves. Let's check your talus curl and navicular. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, that feels a lot better. You see them, and maybe there's less external rotation, more, and it's like, whoa, like maybe that intervention with aligning the foot a little bit better is putting less torsional stress on his Achilles, which is then going to negate something that he could have coming down the road if he continues moving like that. So it's just a whole new lens and filter of how I look at movement, even if I'm not using the like hands-on skills that I learned with athletes tomorrow. That filter that I now have begin to at least add to my process has been really cool. It feels like I've began to open Pandora's box to this whole new way of like looking and assessing movement.
Nice.
And the last thing I'll say is I think that like we were kind of talking about earlier, I think that like within training, within like really life, but like there should be like a yin and yang to everything you do. And force plates are like the objective uh um there's like especially if we're looking at metrics, there's not much subjectivity to those. Whereas like assessing movement and see somebody's foot externally rotated and wanting to assess their navicular, that's just like more subjective and fluid. And I think it's important to have both of those lenses because like the force plate can tell you a lot, watching movement can tell you a lot. And if we're talking objective, subjective, they're very different. So it's important to have like a spectrum of approaches within your toolbox and not just be married to one type.
Nice. Nice. I love it. That's all the question I have for today.
Cool.
So obviously, for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they find you and your online course,
Yep.
your podcast?
Yeah. So the easiest place to find all of this is probably just like my Instagram. It's at Hunter Eyes, which is EIS_TFS, which stands for the Force System. And then you can go to theforcesystem.com, which has all my courses, education, things like that. And then the podcast that me and my good friend Mike Sullivan run is called Move the Needle, the Human for Performance Podcast. And you can find that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anything like that. So I would say that those are probably the best places to see what I'm doing or see what we're doing with the podcast.
Nice. Nice.